It's finally over. Scotland has a new parliament, and it bears more than just a passing resemblance to the old parliament. Will anything change over the next 5 years, or has a new Scottish elite found the formula for keeping the status quo intact? My name's Kat Boyd, and welcome to the final episode of ConterLive. Before I introduce our guests tonight, let me take a second to say that we are entirely supported by word of mouth and your generosity. So please take 1 second, if you can, to help others find us by liking and subscribing to everything by Independence Live and Conter. You can find us at conter.co.uk, and if you're feeling extra generous, please back independent media by giving us a small monthly donation. Now, we're confronted with shocking scenes coming out of Palestine. Palestinians have been shot at, beaten and arrested during 3 consecutive nights of Israeli military raids on Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's Islam's 3rd holiest site, and during Ramadan. At least 35 people, including 12 children, have been killed in Israeli bombing on the Gaza Strip. This comes just 1 week after an Israeli court ordered the eviction of Palestinian families from the East Jerusalem neighbourhood of Sheikh Jarrah. These evictions are illegal under international law, and Israel's leading human rights group say it's become an apartheid state. But will our politicians finally develop any moral courage on the question of the Middle East? Meanwhile, in Scotland, it's a case of meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Another SNP narrow minority backed by the Greens, another promise to fulfil a mandate for a referendum. The Tory opposition is literally unchanged. Labour and the Lib Dems are struggling to find a role. Has anything changed with this election? Elsewhere in the rest of the UK, last week saw pretty mixed results for the Labour Party. In Wales, Mark Drakeford, a self-declared socialist, led Labour to a historic victory. But in England, Keir Starmer looks unprincipled and unpopular. His Labour Party once again took a hammering across the red wall seats, and his authority has been weakened yet again by a failed effort to scapegoat Angela Rayner. But is Starmer heading for an early exit? To discuss this and more, I'm delighted to say that joining me tonight for our final episode are, firstly, Irvine Welsh, acclaimed novelist, playwright and screenwriter. Secondly, we have Hollie Cameron, one-time Labour candidate for Glasgow Kelvin. Thirdly, we have Graham Campbell, SNP Glasgow City Councillor and an SNP candidate in this election. And lastly, we have David Jameson, the editor of Conter and co-host with me of the Conter podcast, Contercast. Welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us tonight. So I just want to kick straight off with what's dominating the news right now. As I said earlier, we'll start by discussing the crisis in the Middle East. Now, Irvine, I'll come to you first on this. Israel's own leading human rights group, B'Tselem, calls the situation apartheid and is directly comparing what's going on to white supremacy as it was in South Africa. Does the situation in Israel now demand a similar response of boycott, divestment and sanctions? What's your view on this?
About what's happened recently, because I've been in the studio for this week, over this weekend, and I haven't been, but from what I can gather, it's exactly the same thing that's been going on and on and on, and it flares up every so often, and it seems to be a concerted effort on part of the Israel government to basically make life absolutely untenable for Palestinians. So it's it's a situation that how does this move on? How does this alter? I mean, people have stopped talking about a kind of 2-state solution now. And really, it's so kind of soul destroying. You don't know where this is going. There seems to be absolutely zero progress made. And I think that the issue with turning Israel into into South Africa, it goes back into the whole nature of the Israeli state. I mean, it's like a lot of the opponents of Israel as a concept they don't want Israel to exist. I mean, the opponents of South Africa didn't want South Africa not to exist. They wanted it not to be an apartheid state. And I think this is the whole issue is that every kind of opponent becomes bundled with, and it suits extremists on both sides to say that to have this kind of this bogus in a way connection between kind of Israel and anti-Semitism, but it's something that it's something that's always there in the background. So I mean, I think that eventually, what will happen? I mean, the atrocities are such that it's like that. It can't be. There have to be sanctions against Israel. There has to be some idea that there can be regime change within Israel. That there can be an Israeli government and Israeli people who want to have some dialogue with the Palestinians. We haven't got that right now.
Thanks, Irvine. So, I mean, one of the traditional places for putting forward these demands of boycott, divestment and sanctions, be it in South Africa or Israel, has traditionally been in the labour movement. So, Hollie, I'd like to come to you on this topic, because I think recently the Labour Party has really struggled to articulate support for the Palestinian cause. Under New Labour, of course, there was a big moment for uncritical support for Israel. Then we've had the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn. Has Labour become a bit of a lost cause for international solidarity? I don't know if Hollie can hear us. Hollie, I'm not sure that you can hear us. Okay, so David, I'm going to move on to yourself, because I'm quite keen to get your take on it. Because in the past, you've been really critical of the Scottish government for not speaking out against the Israeli, American and British various foreign policies. But in this case, Nicola Sturgeon has already come out and said that Israeli actions are indeed a violation of international law. Surely that's a major rhetorical difference between the British government line and the Scottish government line. Do you think that you could be guilty of judging Holyrood by a different standard than judging Westminster?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question of the difference in rhetoric between Nicola Sturgeon and even more so, actually, Alan Smith. If you've seen his letter that he issued from the Parliament, and I know there's a debate coming up in Parliament, there's clearly a huge rhetorical difference between Holyrood and Westminster. Actually, if anything, the language coming out of Westminster parties is even more intransigent than it was in the past, and I think that's partly a consequence of the crackdown against the pro-Palestine movement we've seen across the UK. But what I would still say about the statements that we've seen from, so Alan Smith's statements, for example, said that the UK government should consider reducing its diplomatic relations with the Israeli state, and that is a new departure. But what I would still say is, in Scotland, there's still a degree of buck passing here. What's the UN going to do? What's the EU going to do? What's the UK going to do about the situation in Palestine? There's a great deal more that could be getting done in Scotland right now. I mean, it was interesting, for example, that in the Queen's speech yesterday, the Tories proposed legislation that would ban public sector bodies from engaging in boycott, divestment and sanctions of Israel. And on the one hand, that represents the Tories' determination to crack down on political dissent yet again. But on the other, it rather does show that public bodies could already be doing this. There's more scope in Scotland. Scotland doesn't have foreign policy powers, that's true, but there's still much more scope for direct solidarity than currently is going on. There's still the consulate in Edinburgh. I mean, if we're talking about reducing diplomatic relations with Israel, just close the consulate, just refuse to accept the consulate anymore, because I think this is a time for action. We've had these words, as Irvine was saying, this comes up. Roughly every kind of 2, 3, 5 years, there's fresh atrocities, there's more rhetoric. I think now there needs to be action.
Thanks, David. Graham, what's your take on this, particularly David's points that there is still there's a great deal more that can be done in Scotland?
I'm not sure if there is a great deal more. I would agree with the general thrust of the discussion that we've had so far, that clearly the reason why the Tories want to ban local authorities, universities and students' unions from boycott, divestment and sanctions is because that tactic worked for a whole period of time when we were all actively trying to do it. And we were asked to do that by Palestinian civic society organizations. So they asked us to do that. And the backlash we've had against BDS has been taken the form of very clever Israeli ambassador Mark Regev when he was here in London. He was the one who really bolstered the tagging us Palestinian activists as anti-Semitic, and that tactic unfortunately has worked for the whole last period of time, since the previous outrage against Gaza in 2014, I think it was the last one. Now, pretty clearly, after 70 years of occupation, no bunch of people is ever going to accept having that done to them quietly. So, particularly we've had the coalescence of the end of Ramadan with this Jerusalem Day, which is usually a day when right-wing nationalists march through to celebrate Israel's occupation of East Jerusalem. Now, obviously, for people like me who believe in a two-state solution, I'm one of those who does. But I also think that there's another factor to the two-state solution, which is you're seeing this now in this revolt this week. People who are Arab citizens, Palestinians who live in Israeli cities, are actually out on the streets also rioting and demanding justice from a regime that treats them as second-class citizens. So even if there is a two-state solution, the idea that either of those two states can realistically treat the citizens of the other state as second-class citizens within their borders, that's just not going to work. Now, obviously, we've got an aggressive, horrible Israeli regime under Netanyahu, which is determined to push ahead with illegal settlements, and nobody's punishing them. So I suppose from the British point of view, I would like to see the British government say it's going to take action and sanctions against Israel, but I think that's very, very unlikely. The best we can do in Scotland is obviously show our solidarity with the Palestinians. But the reality is that our government, much as it can protest, it doesn't have control because we are not an independent country.
Thanks, Graham. Hollie, I see you're back and can probably hear us a bit clearer now. I'll come back to you on that question that I asked previously. I think it is important to recognise that there has been, these developments within the Labour Party, the uncritical support for Israel during New Labour, then the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn. Is Labour a lost cause for international solidarity now?
Thank you. I hope my connection's a lot better. I plugged in the cable as opposed to being on the Wi-Fi, so hopefully you can hear me. Absolutely not. The Labour is definitely not a lost cause. I know that there's a very proud pro-Palestine international solidarity and BDS movement within the Labour Party, which still exists. Credit where it's due. I know that Anas Sarwar, as well as Nicola Sturgeon, sent solidarity to the protests in Glasgow on Saturday, just gone. And there has been a statement released by the Labour leadership. It was a joint statement from Keir Starmer and Lisa Nandy, calling for a ceasefire and reinforcing their support for a two-state solution. Lisa Nandy has a long history of being a supporter of the Palestine movement. She's been to Palestine, so it's something that still exists within the Labour Party and is still a proud tradition here. What I would just say is that there's been a lot made of the issue in the party in recent years, and I think that on all sides we could probably do a bit better. I think that the issue is very, very straightforward for me as a person, and that anybody who would conflate anti-racism with anti-Semitic sentiment is not my command, and isn't somebody who would be welcome in the Labour Party. And I think that that's as simple as it gets for most members, and a lot of the people that you have in the pro-Palestine movement in the Labour Party, the vast majority of them fall under that category. They are proud pro-Palestinians who want to see peace in that area, are against the harming of civilians.
Thanks, Hollie. Unfortunately, we do have to move on to discussing the election results at the moment. But before we do, I just want to announce the demonstrations in solidarity with Palestine that are taking place around the country. There's a demonstration in Dundee this Friday at 2 p.m. in the city square. On Saturday, there are events in Edinburgh, Inverness, Aberdeen throughout the day. And on Sunday, there is a protest in George Square, Glasgow. Now, hopefully you can see all the details of these at the bottom of your screen now. Yep, you can. So that's all the details for the demonstrations. The details also be tweeted from the Conter Twitter account, and I hope that anyone who's able to can come out and show solidarity with those living under military occupation at the same time as dealing with COVID crisis. So now moving on to last week's election. This is our last episode of ConterLive, as I said, and the main thing to talk about today is really what happened in the Scottish Parliament election 2021. Irvine, I'm going to come to you first. It's been a pretty eventful 5 years, I think. We've had Brexit, and we've had global pandemic, but we've also had, climate change strikes, the collapse of the Red Wall for Labour, and closer to home, we've had the SNP's failures on drugs deaths and the care home crisis. And I could go on. But the Scottish Parliament has stayed more or less the same following last week's election. Do you think this means that voters are satisfied with the status quo?
The SNP line that we've got to show responsible governance during COVID and do the best we can. So it's almost like, it's a bit like kind of suspended animation for a year, really, with COVID. I think it's given everybody some kind of a fill-up, but that, it's whatever you think about it and however you think it's been kind of treated, people generally seem to have got behind, seem to have got behind governments, basically, and they've given them a bit of slack. But I think that really for the SNP, I think they really do have to deliver on a second referendum, and they really did have the mandate after Brexit to do that. And I think now that I think that the further down the line, I think patience will run out if they don't deliver on the second referendum.
Why is it, do you think, Irvine, that people are getting behind the government? Is that just because of COVID? Because I feel like some of the more traditional parties in Britain, like Labour and the Tories, are getting a bit of a kicking. The Tories over Brexit. Obviously, like the sort of most prominent Tories at the time were back in Remain. The Labour Party still getting, bad ratings in the polls. Keir Starmer's popularity is failing. What's going on?
I think with England, it's, I think really it's only really the electoral system that keeps the Conservative Labour parties alive. I mean, they're on the life support of the electoral system. There's no, politics would have fractured and delineated in a completely different way without that ossification of the electoral system. But you've kind of seen with a lot of the working class vote, or an element of the working class vote in England, that people don't really care now. They don't really sort of, there is that, it's almost like the anger against the Labour Party is so palpable. And I mean, I think the attitude with so many working class people in England is that we kind of expect the Conservatives to not to be in our interests and all that, but there's a sense of deep betrayal for the Labour Party that people that I've felt this for people in England for years and years and years, and I think it's kind of coalesced a bit now that they're kind of basically still giving Tony Blair a kicking, and they put and they've made the absolute ridiculous error of putting somebody who's, you know, the least suitable person for winning back the north of England and Midland working class Labour vote into the position of power. So it's absolutely, they've managed to massively shoot themselves in the foot, and you know, they seem to do it in every possible conceivable way. You know, whether it's like a 70s nostalgia trip or a 90s nostalgia trip, it's not really working. I mean, I think that there is a route to Labour, for a radical Labour Party for power in England, but it's not the one that they've been pursuing. Not either of the routes have been pursuing.
Thanks, Hollie. I'm going to have to come to you on this. As I said in the introduction, you know, last week's election saw pretty mixed results for the Labour Party. But what Irvine's saying here, I think, you know, will ring true with a lot of people who are, you know, watching the show. Like, Keir Starmer seems very much in the Blairite mould. Why put him in charge of this when you're trying to win back those working class heartlands? Keir Starmer might be more typical of a new Labour base, professional managerial class types in London or urban areas, something like that. So, I mean, is Keir Starmer's leadership in crisis? He essentially blamed Corbyn for the defeat in Hartlepool, then attempted to pin it on Angela Rayner. Is Keir Starmer on his way out?
I don't know if he's on his way out yet, but if he doesn't think he's in trouble, then I think that he probably has less of a sense of self-preservation than is recommended in politics. I think that the failures in England last week really showed that the Labour Party has really, really struggled to get to the heart of issues and of a messaging that people really understand and care about. The last time that was successful was, of course, in 2017, and a number of factors came together in that. We had, as far as I'm concerned, we had a manifesto that was unapologetic about its ambition and its socialist values. It was a manifesto that was in the context of leaving the European Union. It was a manifesto that acknowledged the result and put its pitch to the people of the kind of society we could build in the wake of that. It acknowledged and decided to work within the boundaries that, you know, whether you liked it or not, the electorate had set with the referendum on the European Union the year before. And it had very, very energised membership and local campaigns who really are the spine and the moral compass of this movement. They keep the movement going, and that's the same for this past election, whether you were in Scotland like I was. I was elsewhere in Glasgow campaigning, and as you know, if you were in Wales or England, the local volunteers and local campaigners keep the movement honest on the ground. As for the removal of Angela Rayner, I know that you know, she's taken a dignified approach and she doesn't want to kind of broach it in media interviews. She's still got her position as deputy leader. But what I would just say is that it does seem like this is being taken as an excuse for an even harder pivot to the right, which is and should be concerning to anybody who holds deeply socialist values and who believes in a Labour Party that is at its core representatives for working class and trade unions in Parliament.
Don't we have a similar problem in Scotland though, Hollie? Like, I mean, I think of Anas Sarwar as like being in that tradition of a Blairite. The media in Scotland seem to love him. They think that, you know, he does a little clip of him dancing. You know, he's going to be like the next First Minister or whatever. But I see him very much in that same mould. So I think that the problem exists in Scotland too, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I can see where Anas and the people who are surrounding him and advising him can understand what they're getting at. They understand and they're taking and running with the principle that people need to be able to look at the leader of a political party and consider them to be a legitimate political player. And Anas Sarwar is somebody who, you know, both for his own politics, but also as a consequence of a failing Labour Party that is losing representation steadily in Scotland. He's one of the longest established figureheads of Labour in Scotland. So you can understand the logic from those who support Anas as leader, that they want somebody who is recognisable and is going to be credible in the eyes of the electorate. Not even I would deny that when I was on the doorstep last week, lots of people were saying, "Oh, that Anas, he seemed really energetic. I kind of like him." That doesn't mean that those people were voting for us, which is the problem. But you know, I think the logic with Anas and his leadership is that will come. What I would suggest is that, you know, you don't have to undermine your principles or apologise for being a socialist in order to be taken seriously in Scottish politics, and we saw that in 2017.
Thanks, Hollie. Graham, I'm going to come to you on this because I think that there's quite an interesting theme coming out of what Irvine and Hollie have both been talking about. So we've got this issue within the Labour Party, which is, you know, happening to social democratic parties all across Europe. I think the word that gets used is PASOKification, you know, the collapse of social democracy. Those big organisations in most major states across Europe, is definitely happening to the Labour Party in the UK. Do you think that there's a danger of the SNP falling victim to this? I know that the recent some of the recent research that Conter has done has shown that the support base for the SNP has changed. That, you know, middle class voters are moving towards independence, and research shows that support for independence is falling amongst poorer people in Scotland. You know, is the SNP in danger, especially after the last week's election? Is it in danger of becoming a party of power rather than its traditional role as a party of protest?
I have to take it, I disagree with every single word that you've just uttered, because I just don't think that any of that actually represents the reality of what actually has been going on in Scotland. But firstly, I think there was certainly a case that when social democratic parties across Europe were led by Blairite and Brownites, and there was a whole raft of them which were in government at the time the European Union went towards the euro, who dominated that project back in the mid to early 90s. That's long gone. That project now, overwhelmingly, the governments in Europe are right or right of centre governments. It's very rare now to have a left of centre government that's dominant the way that we've got the SNP in Scotland. That's now a rarity. But the very fact that you've got a government that had in its manifesto to nationalise the railway, create a national care service, create free dentistry, extend free school meals. I could go on and on and on, but there are many things that would be normally associated with progressive left of centre social democratic parties, which have been the norm of politics actually in Scotland under the SNP, and indeed before us when the Labour Lib Dem coalition was in. There has been a left of centre consensus in Scottish politics for quite a while, which is unusual in Europe. So first of all, we're an outlier. So that's the first thing. I don't necessarily accept your analysis. Secondly, it's obvious that the SNP has got the mass base of support it has. It's because it's won the allegiance of working class people post the yes referendum, yes vote in 2014. That working class base that used to vote Labour votes for us now, and votes for us pretty overwhelmingly, as the results in this election show that we've not only consolidated that base, we've actually increased it a bit. And some of the signs of that are in areas where you would expect the turnout to be low, which it was last time in 2016, areas like West Pilton, for example, Still, the turnout was still quite low compared to the middle class neighbourhoods of Edinburgh, but it doubled in West Bilton from, I think, 19% to just in the high to mid 30s range. So the working class neighbourhoods, which you'd think would be more disenchanted and sector after government's been around for this long, actually turned out in greater numbers to vote for it. So I don't actually accept that working class people are losing support for the SNP. It is true that middle class voters are moving, because post-Brexit, they are moving towards independence. There's no doubt about that. There's been a shift amongst a certain section of them. And obviously this skill of social democratic politics has been about how can you keep an alliance between working class supporters and middle class supporters for a progressive change that makes sense to both of those classes. We do that in the form of independence as the vehicle to do that. Other social democratic parties do that in the form of trying to create a new society and create a consensus around building public services. We've obviously had to struggle with the Tories doing what they've done in government over the last 11 years. And in that context, it's still quite remarkable that we've been able to do what we can do. But there are limits to the way we can mitigate against austerity. That's why we need independence. And that was very clearly expressed in the way the electorate voted. And the final thing I'd say is this about the COVID thing. I was one of the founders of Zero COVID Scotland, and we've been campaigning for an elimination strategy. And Scotland has benefited from being closer to an elimination strategy than the Boris Johnson strategy of let it go, let it hang out. Because we've done that, we've been more strict with the lockdown and more precise about the safety measures that we're taking. Fewer people have died. Still, there's some outlying points about what's happened with the care crisis. Of course, that's been a disaster, but that's been a disaster all over Europe. So every country in Europe has got that wrong. And there are lessons we can learn from that, and obviously we'll get an inquiry. But the fact that we've diverged from the four-nation strategy as much as we have has been why we've had a better result, and more people trust the government as a result of it. So I think that's why we've got the support we have.
I mean, I appreciate and respect your confidence in those figures, Graham, but the data that we have from our research is that the individual level survey data from the Scottish Social Attitude Survey and the British Election Survey are the two biggest surveys of electoral preferences in the UK, show these bases of support are changing. I can see that David hasn't come in for a bit, so I'm going to bring David in here as well. David, what do you make of this? Is Scotland, a historic outlier? Are the SNP not at risk of, becoming that? I saw that someone flashed up in the ticker tape there saying that Nicola Sturgeon's government was absolute third wave Blairite. I mean, that's a view that exists. What is your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if you were to think that the SNP were the lone social democratic holdout in the entirety of Europe, you would, be saying we should be bottling this and selling it across Europe. I don't think that is the case. I think, as you said, Kat, this is a worldwide phenomenon by this point. Obviously you have the decline of the Parti Socialiste in France, the decline of the SPD in Germany, which looks like it's going to get replaced by the Greens. In France, the Socialist Party was replaced by En Marche and the National Front. In Greece, PASOK was replaced by Syriza. But this is going on. I mean, in Italy, the Partito Democratico has disappeared, essentially, is a worldwide phenomenon. And I want to say, Keir Starmer is crap. He is useless, right? But I don't really think this is about him. I think Irvin's absolutely right to say in many ways Corbyn's still paying for Blair, and I suspect Keir Starmer is still paying for Blair. This is about the long-term decline and decomposition of the social democratic base. People forget that with social democracy, it wasn't a project handed down from on high by politicians. It was a relationship to a mass base in society that had to be developed through concrete action. After the Second World War, Labour was a party of massive house building, massive support for industries, industrial strategies that picked winners, that sent millions of people into jobs that were exploitative, but that were still, you could be in them for life, and you could learn skills and so on and so forth, and you could have a house and you could support a family through that kind of traditional structure and so on. What we've seen in recent decades is that there aren't political parties which defend that kind of settlement, which are mainstream mass parties, and it's slowly disintegrated. And to me, what the SNP represents, I mean, there's something really fascinating going on here, which is that social democracy has declined both in Scotland and in England. And it has resulted in a political formation which is different, both sides of the border, but I think categorically similar, which is big tent nationalist centre parties. That's what Boris Johnson's building in England. He's not building some far-right party, you know, like in Hungary or something like that. He's building a big, broad-based, middle and working class Tory party. That's the project. Hence all this money that's getting thrown to northern seats and so on. In Scotland, on a different basis, with some different policies and some different attitudes, a big tent centrist nationalist bloc is being created. In both cases, the active class element is the ruling class, is the capitalist class. And you can see that in the policy perspectives fundamentally of both parties.
Thanks, David. I mean, I think that we are kind of talking around the issue of independence, so I want to bring it back to that. Irvine, you mentioned earlier about the mandate, that the SNP had a mandate after Brexit for another referendum. Now, unionists are saying that even though the SNP are the biggest party in the Scottish Parliament, that they don't have a legitimate mandate for another referendum. What do you make of this argument?
You know, people come up with, and you know, they use the numbers and the different voting systems, and you know, a mandate for something down south isn't a mandate for something in Scotland. It's nonsense. I mean, it's like people have consistently voted SNP and they've voted for independence. They voted for an independence referendum in this election. I think that really we should have gone straight to an independence referendum after the Brexit result, and I think that was such a major thing to remove a country from a whole set of European relationships that have developed. And you know, I'm not kind of a massive big kind of EC fan, but I think that in terms of democracy, there's just something that doesn't sit right there, and you have to, if you know, I think it's like the weird thing about it is, it's like most people in England don't care about this. They don't really care about it at all. And I think that's one of the things that that could percolate up to the Conservatives, so that if they're trying to kind of serious about trying to develop this working class base. I'm not really sure they are, to be quite honest. But I think that if they're looking for that that to hold on to this short-term kind of electoral gain, and they want to do something fundamental, I think the best thing they could do, the best English nationalist card they could play, would be to say to Scotland and Wales and all that, just get on with it, go, because it's like it's a massive distraction for England, and it's I don't really see any kind of point or any currency in this now, and it's mirrored in the schizophrenia. With they just want this to go away, and it's not going to go away, So just get rid of it.
I mean, I couldn't agree more about the issue around Brexit. I mean, I'm very critical of the European Union, consistently critical, along with other people who are involved in Conter. But to watch Scottish institutions be treated like petulant children when it came to the actual negotiations, I think told us something very clear about British democracy and how it functions. So, I mean, I think that the issue that a lot of people will have is that we've heard this kind of, need for a mandate now. So Nicola Sturgeon reportedly told Boris Johnson on a phone call that a second referendum was when, not if. And we have heard that kind of rhetoric before. Do you think we'll see a referendum in the next parliamentary term, or do you think it will be, another 5 years?
I think they'll have to make some kind of a deal. I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I think that there'll probably be some face-saving deal between Sturgeon and Johnson in some way, because I think that's the only way this impasse can be broken. I mean, I think that it sort of it begs the question. It's like it goes back into the Labour's failings in England. I don't think that people see the British state as a legitimate basis for any kind of class politics now. I think that Labour suffered for that reason in England, and I think that there's a big question mark over the political legitimacy of the British state now. I mean, you look at what it's been for the last 40 years. It's been all about the distribution of the resources of that state to the richest of up to a transnational elite. And it seems to serve no other purpose. I mean, the way the SNP has managed to score is because it does have a defined project, has a defined radical project, which is independence. And I think that project, when you look at the emergence of organisations like the North of England Independence Party, I think that project of that decentralising project, that renewal project, is something that in some ways is going on right across these islands. And I think it's to do with the secular decline of imperialism and deindustrialisation and the end of the UK as a state.
Yeah, the Northern Independence Party is definitely quite an interesting development, I think. Hollie, I'm going to come to you because you were supposed to be a candidate in this election, but you were dropped by Labour HQ against the wishes of your local branch Haddad, and that's because you supported holding a second independence referendum. Why do you think that there is so much reluctance to talk about changing the position on a second referendum within the party? I'm desperate to know, is it genuinely ideological? Is it tactical about chasing the unionist vote? Or is it just true that the party in Scotland are controlled at a distance by London?
So here's the awkward bit. It's actually both. So it's tactical and ideological, certainly in this most recent Scottish election. I know that going into the election and going into candidate selections, the Scottish Policy Forum, which has representatives of trade unions, constituency Labour parties, and other important figures in the Labour Party, delegated to it, had passed a policy which was challenged and debated by those who feel the same as I do, that we can't continue to deny a second referendum when it seems that people that the Labour Party should be representing want one. However, the policy was passed, and the policy was that the Scottish Labour Party respects the claim of right, but going into the 2021 elections, it will campaign against having a independence referendum in the following term of Parliament, which I consider to be incoherent, and it's not something I believe anyway. It's not something I agree with. I was asked for an interview by the Sunday National, and I gave it, outlining my views. Myself and my friends and advisors, we thought that I could probably get a bit of exposure with people in Glasgow Kelvin constituency to sort of highlight my views. I was selected by my local party because of my history with the Yes movement and because of my beliefs. They felt it would I could connect better with people in this constituency, which was a very heavy Yes constituency. However, the party already knew that it was going into the election with the idea that it would be campaigning against, or it would not countenance, rather, another independence referendum in the next 5 years. And that was before the pandemic even rolled around. I know that since then, the campaign has been focused on recovery and investment in public services, which are good Labour values, and are something that I would have put front and centre as well. It's just it's ideological, but both tactical. I think that the Scottish Labour Party knew it was in for an uphill climb, especially since there was a change of leadership so soon before the election. So while there are there's talk of humbly accepting the result from Scottish Labour HQ, I think they're probably kind of privately going away and thinking, oh well, good, because that could have been much worse. So I think that's where we were. We were hoping not to slide back so far that it would have been even more difficult and embarrassing. And I think that that we didn't do that is being taken as a win.
I mean, Hollie, can I just want to interrupt you to say there that probably you were a better strategist than whoever made the decision in Scottish Labour, because in Glasgow Kelvin, which has traditionally been one of the kind of Glasgow Labour strongholds, Labour have now slipped to 3rd place. I mean, this is like quite unimaginable. I mean, it was the seat that's associated with people like George Galloway, things like that. So, I mean, I think that your points about exposure are really good. But I'm just gonna move this on a little bit, because I want to talk a little bit about the case for independence, because if we're going into another referendum, then we're going to need to have a new case, discussed for independence, because the SNP case recently has been based on the recommendations of the Growth Commission, penned by Andrew Wilson. And two of the most contentious aspects of that report are the fact that it gives up full fiscal control of the economy to the Bank of England and signs Scotland up to the EU demand of limiting deficits to 3% annually. The most important consequence of that would be that an independent Scotland couldn't have committed to something like a furlough scheme and would be forced into austerity budgets. Now, Graham, I know that obviously as our kind of SNP person on the panel, both you and Nicola Sturgeon have actually rightly said that the Growth Commission is out of date. But was it ever in date? I think it is, some people would say it's at best a short-sighted model Scotland's future after the collapsed and discredited Celtic Tiger economy. And that's putting it quite generously. Do you think that the Growth Commission has done some serious harm to the case for independence?
First of all, the main thing it's done, it's provided people like you and with the convenient excuse to slag us off all as neoliberals. It was a daft document when it was produced, because frankly, it was out of date economically, because it didn't really take into account the economics of the time when it was published in 2018. It obviously couldn't take into account Brexit, because that wasn't known yet. It didn't take into account the impact of automation and technology, and it didn't take into effect the impact of climate change and the need to go to net zero. So with the four major important crises not covered by it, of course, it couldn't be an adequate document. That said, there were 50 or so recommendations within it, 7 of which related to currency. And most of the critics I've ever heard of or read about on this clearly haven't read the document, because the document in about 11 places explicitly says, even Andrew Welsh thinks that austerity doesn't work as an economic strategy, that austerity in terms of budget deficit reduction methods and so on are completely anti-growth and therefore are not effective. So even he, as a fairly centre-right economist, rejects those things, and yet it's been used as an ideological foil for everybody to say, look how neoliberal the SNP is. It's a daft document. Wish we'd never published it, but the reality is it's now out of date, and it's out of date for some obvious reasons, because it hasn't taken into account the things I've mentioned. Now, what it does do, which is actually quite useful, it does set up about 40 things which will be necessary in an independent country: having your own clearing bank, having your own currency system, having all of those things which are necessary for an independent state to have. It even argues for a gender pay commission, which is something that other countries in the Nordic Belt have. So it argues for a number of reform-based things that the state should have, which, okay, I could probably live with most of those things. The things that weren't accepted, and the members of the SNP conference explicitly rejected in 2019, were the elements around sterlingization and keeping sterlingization for any serious length of time in the transition towards our own independent currency. One of the main reasons why we lost the referendum in 2014 was the lack of clarity around having our own currency, which everybody knew that we had to have. Our answer to what will happen if the UK doesn't let you use the pound should have been, we will have a Scottish pound or Scottish currency. That should have been the answer. And that would have killed most of that conversation. Unfortunately, because our prospectus didn't have that, the next one is going to have to be very, very clear. And I think the next one very clearly will be independent currency. We will be in charge of our own destiny economically straight away. We are leaving the UK state because we want to leave their neoliberal, monetarized capitalist form of economics. We want to leave that behind and have a fairer, more equal, more social democratic society. That's a consensus across a lot of parties, not just in the SNP. So to get there, we're going to have a state with the full economic powers. And that is one of the things, of course, that will be sorted out when we're getting into the process towards the next referendum.
Yeah. I mean, just in defence of those who are like myself, who are pro-independence but anti-growth commission, it wasn't just people like myself, it was also lots of people within the SNP were really critical of the growth commission as well. Oh, wow. And I think are very much looking forward to a new strategy. What's the sort of timeline for a new strategy to be delivered? Is this going to, I think that's the worry about the wording in the referendum, isn't it? About a referendum after the recovery. When is the case going to be made? Or is that happening, closer to the referendum time?
Well, pretty clearly, people are already starting to do economic analyses just now, starting to delve into that territory. I'm very keen that a wider spectrum of views around that should be included as possible. So I'm happy to take a bit of time to do that, because I think the economic perspective, the people who were sort of risk averse, that 10 to 20% of the electorate who maybe in their heart wanted independence but didn't believe it was economically viable, the people who were worried about their pensions and their money and their houses, and etc. Understandable things they were worried about. We need to be able to clearly answer those questions. And it was not reasonable to have asked them in the last couple of years, because frankly, we couldn't have given them definitive answers. What will be the trading system post-Brexit? What will be the border situation with England if we happen to be the border and we join the European Union? We need to be able to answer those questions definitively. And so it was reasonable to not ask them until we could have a set of situations where we know the answers. Now, I hope that in the next, I expect the timing, I'm expecting it in 2023. That's when I think the vote will be. And I think that the preparation time up to that is more than enough time to develop an economic perspective which shows where the country's going to, what direction the project will take. That hope will be very clearly to the left, very clearly in the direction of a more equal society, and then one that tackles the climate crisis by properly investing in all those things.
Thanks, Graham. Hollie, I'm going to bring you in just now because you want to come in on this, but if you keep it brief, because I'm going to bring David in, and then we'll close. We're a little bit going over time, but if you can be brief, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. I just wanted to say I know that earlier on Graham took exception to the fact that there were some comments made about managerialism and Blairism in the Scottish National Party, and I think that being as we are based in Glasgow, you don't have to look very far for evidence of that. You just have to look to Glasgow City Council chambers. That's the place you need to look. With respect to the case for independence, I know that as somebody who is in that small but vital chunk of people who considers themselves to be for or against, depending on the case that's put to them, I would just want to know how progressive people like yourself and your comrades, Graham, would square the circle of an independent Scotland that is progressive and prosperous, that is a member of the European Union uncritically and automatically. And I want to furthermore ask how you would approach the sort of trope that's going around at the moment about uniting the country. How would you approach that, given that your talk about taking some time to consider other viewpoints tonight just isn't very convincing.
Thanks, Hollie. Graham, I'm gonna let you respond to that, because I think that there is a point to what Hollie's saying about the about automatic EU membership. Nicola Sturgeon has said that there wouldn't be a referendum on the EU, and there would be in the case of independence, we would be seeking to rejoin the European Union straight away. So it would be great if you could pick up on some of those points. I'll then bring David in, and we'll round up there.
I'm not sure Hollie actually asked me a question. She made me a statement, and okay, she's entitled to that view, but I don't obviously share that view. But I would say this: if we were having a normal conversation about normal times, and we weren't coming out of a COVID crisis which has pretty much destroyed everybody's economy and lost literally millions of lives around the world, we would have had a very different set of circumstances. I'm quite convinced that probably we may well have had an actioning of the mandate that we had in 2016, that if the conditions changed around Brexit, that we had a mandate to hold a referendum then. I would have expected the referendum in 19 or 20. The reality was that also Brexit took a hell of a lot longer to resolve than everybody anticipated. So I'd anticipate that we'd be having a referendum while still in the orbit of the EU's common market and single market. We're outside it now, and by the time we get to the referendum, we don't know what the economic situation will be in 2022, 2023 yet. So I think we have to have a specific economic analysis for that time, and it may be by that time we can't rejoin the EU automatically. Now, my views, I'm fairly flexible about this. Many comrades in the party will say that we're in favour of EFTA membership as an immediate strategy if we are able to become independent. It may be that we have to have a referendum to rejoin the EU. That may be the case, because by the time that happens, I'm thinking we vote in 2023, we may action it by 2025 or 26. We will have been out of the EU for more than 5 years. So the economic circumstances will be different. So I think there's some justification for maybe thinking of having a referendum to rejoin.
Thanks, Graham. David, I'm going to come to you last, because it's actually based on some of what Graham has said, because you've argued that the SNP should be more aggressive in holding a referendum. Lots of people would think that it's actually quite reasonable for the SNP to say, right, we've got to wait until we've recovered economically from COVID before we hold a referendum. That seems to be like what popular opinion, the public opinion is, that we should actually wait. Let's see what the recovery from COVID is like before we bound into another referendum. Has the SNP leadership won the argument for caution and playing the long game?
It's interesting that this idea emerged over recent years that the SNP leadership were the cautious ones, and there were a bunch of hotheads out there in the independence movement. The only people calling for a referendum in 2021 that I saw, and this was until very recently, this was a couple of months ago, were Ian Blackford and Mike Russell. Mike Russell was telling foreign diplomats we were having a referendum in a few months' time in 2021 until very recently. And, these are very senior figures in the SNP. Now, of course, that was about spiking the confidence, holding up the confidence of a section of the independence movement ahead of an election as sort of classic manipulation. I don't think anyone would disagree that you can't have a referendum until the pandemic is over. But there is a big distinction between it being after a pandemic and it being after a recovery, which is what John Swinney recently said. Because then you have to ask the question, whose recovery is this going to be? We saw from the Queen's speech what kind of recovery this is going to be. Very pro-big business. And it has to be said that the SNP's plans for recovery so far published are of a very similar mould. I mean, it tells you something that in the Queen's speech we hear about free ports in England, and that the Scottish government has announced that it wants its own free ports, but it's going to call them green ports. But they're still just, low tax, low regulation, all this kind of stuff. So that the ideas of how you get recovery, and one of the principal ideas that's come out of the Scottish Government, is selling off Scotland's national assets, clearing away planning, regulation, and all this kind of stuff to sell off national assets as fast as we can ahead of COP26 of all things. Now, here's the problem, right? In the last 5 years, the SNP and the Greens have passed enormous cuts into working class communities all over Scotland. Yes, with mitigations. Yes, with their hands tied to an extent by the monies that are coming up from the central state and so on. But what was always said about that by Nicola Sturgeon and co was, well, yeah, we have to do this because we need the full powers of independence. So if people are saying that we're not going to have a challenge for independence before the recovery, then what they're saying is we are prepared to pass yet more cuts and more attacks on the working class in Scotland. I think people have to choose and be honest about what we're doing.
I think you have to be honest with what we're doing, mate. I think I've been a councillor for 4 years.
I'm just gonna intervene there because I want to just finish on possibly an optimistic note, but we'll wait and see. With the last word to Irvine. Now, Irvine, do you think there's anything to be optimistic about? Do you think if we have another referendum in the next 5 years, we'll win? Tell me some good news.
It's changed very, very quickly. Things are very volatile. Just the era we live in. It's impossible to kind of play Nostradamus and all that. But I think the things have been bleak for so long. I always think that physics. It's like physics, action and action equal and opposite and all that. So I think that there is good news ahead. There is optimism ahead. There's always grounds for optimism.
That's great. Thanks very much. And thanks to y'all for joining us today for the final episode from you about what you've thought of our special Scottish election series. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Independence Live for their technical support and for hosting the show. Without them, none of this would have been possible. You can keep up to date with this and loads of other events by subscribing to their YouTube channel or by checking out their website, independencelive.net. In addition to this, I'd like to thank our guests for being part of the discussion today. Please follow them on Twitter. Their Twitter handles will be scrolling along the bottom of the screen now. Finally, thank you to Conter for organising this event. Remember, Conter tries to bring you the best insights, but we're not funded by millionaires. If you can afford it, please support Conter with a small monthly donation. You can do that and a lot more by visiting our website at conter.co.uk. Thanks everyone for watching and good night.